So we're going to talk about Node.js, and as I mentioned, I am not a Node.js expert by any stretch of the imagination. I learned Node.js totally by accident, and what I mean by that is I support a Node.js app in production that well, let's start with who I am. I'm Brian Parks. I'm founder and CEO of Synapse Software. That's my company, which as of today is my full-time job. Thank you. I am a C programmer. I guess I should have started out, hi, I'm Brian Parks and I'm a C programmer.
Hi, Brian.
There we go. So yes, I'm a C programmer. I learned on C and actually learned C, learned another language, learned C, learned another language, learned C, learned other languages. Because it doesn't matter how many times you learn C, if someone says they're a C expert, you know they're either deluded or lying. There's just so much. And at this point, the same can really be said of JavaScript too. There's just so much out there with respect to JavaScript, and that's one of the reasons that this meetup exists, is to, because each one of us certainly can't learn everything there is to know about JavaScript, so we actually need a support group. I guess next we'll be saying, hi, I'm Brian Parks and I'm a JavaScript programmer. We need a support group to help us figure out what all is going on in JavaScript. And as we'll find out very quickly, Node is actually the same way. Node is to JavaScript as JavaScript is to the rest of the world. You can do so much with JavaScript, and you can do almost anything in Node that you can do in JavaScript. It gets scary. Not to scare you off, but there is so much. We could go on for hours and hours, and probably days and days, talking about what is in Node and what it does well and what it doesn't do so well. And there will be time for discussion, but hopefully it won't go on for days and days and days, but it certainly could. There's enough material there. So toward the end of the slideshow, there's a slide that says, this is stuff I'm not talking about. Since learning C, I've also gone to PHP land. That's what I do most of my coding in, though I seem to get paid to do a lot of .NET programming. I don't know how that works out, but it happens. But all this, every time I write in another language, I realize how awesome JavaScript is. So when I'm writing in .NET, it's why isn't C# more like JavaScript? Who here thinks JavaScript is awesome? Pretty much everybody, right? Okay, so JavaScript is awesome. And if you want more about me, there's a SlideShare link. You can find out more about me. So I mentioned that I learned Node.js by accident. I have this app in production, which we'll see a little bit later, that a friend of mine wrote, and he ran out of bandwidth and hosting and something like that. So it ended up on one of my servers. Now I'm maintaining it. I wanted to add some features to it 3 months ago, which meant I had to learn Node. And I didn't get the choice of, like, when you're learning a new framework, you can start with the demo video and learn a little bit of Node and a little bit of what we'll do here. No, I had to learn everything about Node in the span of about an hour, which be thankful you don't have to do that tonight.
Busy hour.
What?
It's a busy hour.
It's a bit. It is in fact a busy hour. And because it's in production, and we'll actually see the source code, it's production code. It's messy. There's a lot of stuff that if I had all the time in the world, I'd go back and rewrite it and use things like Express. Express didn't exist when this app was written, so basically the entire infrastructure is written from the ground up. So you really get to see what Node very specifically is and what Node very specifically isn't, and what's more of a module that's written for Node, which is one of the advantages. So the most concise definition I've seen for what Node is evented I/O for V8 JavaScript. And I put the term non-blocking in there because that's really at the crux of what makes Node.js different from other things. And I think we see that on the next slide or the slide after. So we're all familiar with JavaScript in the browser. We can handle click events. We can handle mouse over events, mouse down events, key press events, that sort of thing. So the evented part is that's not unusual. It's JavaScript. It deals with events very well. V8 JavaScript is the JavaScript execution engine in Google Chrome. So part of the reason for Node's existence is thanks to Google. Part of the reason for Node's existence is a project called CommonJS, which was an effort to make JavaScript run everywhere. So JavaScript runs certainly in the browser. We're used to that, unless some people still have it turned off, which we don't talk about those people. And there are also there's PhoneGap, which allows you to run JavaScript on phones, and I think there are a couple other platforms that allow you to do the same sort of thing. But with Node, you can run JavaScript as console applications, server applications, web applications. You can run you can write JavaScript code that runs just about anywhere. This is actually the blurb that comes from Node.js.org, which, now that I think about it, the site for Node.js doesn't appear in this slideshow anywhere. It's Node.js.org. And it kind of says the same thing as that in, 5 times as many words? 6 times as many words? This link, which is a link in the presentation, is where I went to first learn about Node. It was actually on the homepage of Node.js.org. It's a talk given by Ryan Dahl at a PHP meetup, of all places, about what Node is and why it's awesome.
It's the talk.
It is the talk.
It fills his heart out about why it's so awesome.
And I figured that no matter what I wore tonight, I could not be as fashion backwards as he is in that talk. So if you watch the talk just for that, watch the talk. I pull a couple examples from his talk. I also pull a couple examples from the Node.js website. So why use Node.js? It's non-blocking, it's evented, which are cool features, but that's not really like the marketing speak of why you should actually use it. So I just kind of brainstormed why I might want to use Node.js in certain instances. High throughput is certainly one of them. If you're not familiar with how JavaScript executes in the browser, it's single-threaded. I'm waiting for gasps. It's single-threaded. You have one thread. So that basically means that if you block, you're preventing anything else from happening. That's bad. That's why you run into some pages, and I think Internet Explorer still gives you the error, there is a long-running script on the page. Do you want to stop it? It's Internet Explorer, so forget about stopping JavaScript. You want to stop using Internet Explorer. But that's a result of JavaScript running in a single thread. And Node.js is no different. Node.js, JavaScript's running in a single thread, so you really want to take advantage of that evented model and basically define callbacks for when a certain event happens. Because then your code is just handling events. Something else is handling the event loop. And it means that you shouldn't be busy waiting, you shouldn't be sleeping. That's generally frowned upon in theoretical circles, but we all write sleep statements. We put sleep in production code. We put while true, check some flag, sleep. That's bad, but we all do it because that's just kind of the way you do things in other languages. Not so in Node. Real-time collaboration is probably the most common user-facing reason I've seen Node used. I'm not sure if Hackpad uses Node, but it wouldn't surprise me if they did. Common? There's actually a project that we'll see later that's very similar to Hackpad that is written in Node to give you a bit of an idea of why you might use it for that sort of thing. Horizontal scalability is a big one, and that's not really specific to Node. That's more something that a trend that's happening rather than getting larger machines that can run more processing cycles quicker. You have a bunch of little machines, the Google effect or the Amazon effect. You have a bunch of little machines all doing the same thing, and you spread the load out across all of them, and if one goes down, so what? You've got 500,000 more. The evented model, as I already mentioned, JavaScript for Web Network Console, and like I said, that's more an offshoot of the CommonJS initiative. And something that I'm not going to get into today, but Node Package Manager. I've seen this on a list of like my top 10 reasons why Node is awesome is Node Package Manager. How many PHP developers do we have here? A few. How many of you?
That chair's a little busted.
What's that?
That chair's a little broken.
Oh, okay.
How many of you use pair with PHP? Pair with PHP? Anyone use pair with PHP? Regrettably, yes. Right. So either everybody that I've talked to who uses PHP either doesn't use pair or uses it because it's the only thing that's out there. Node Package Manager is a whole lot better than pair because you have a choice. It's not just this massive framework that's loosely held together by some amorphous community. Each particular piece of functionality is available, and it's pretty awesome. There's very little that hasn't been written for Node. So the next important thing, where do I get it? How many Mac users do we have in the room? Okay, about half the people. Homebrew, how many of you use Homebrew? Okay, and I'm guessing the other half uses Mac ports? Or nothing. Okay, the App Store. Homebrew is awesome. I'm not going to talk about it, but Homebrew is awesome. You should check it out. Homebrew has Node bottled, and if you search for Node.js, it'll come up. The source is also on GitHub. You can compile it, run it if you want to. And there's a download link there. It does run on Windows, and Ryan, in that talk that I mentioned, says that the Windows port is far behind the ports on the other platforms. I don't use Windows, so I don't know if that's improved any. But it's available. It's a command line tool, and I think we'll see that. Yeah, we'll pull that up right now. So yeah, I guess I won't make it full screen. Cool. So yeah, the whole internet thing. Yeah, so oh geez, I can't imagine why you guys have problems with internet. Oxbow guest. There it is. Is there a space in this? Okay. I'm going to go with no space. Right, so it did actually succeed. Node.js. It's called Node.js. It installs a little tool called Node, which is handy. It also installs Node Package Manager, which is awesome, but again, I'm not going to talk about it.
Where you get plugins.
It's basically like Brew. You just type npm search something, and you can search the package registry.
I also have a little tool called, I think it's pronounced NodeMon, would be my guess, not NoDemon, though it's spelled identically. I think I installed this separately. It's basically Node that watches a particular directory, and when you make changes to files, it just refreshes itself. So it's awesome for development. So let's pull up Node. I know all these commands are making it look like macOS is awesome. macOS is awesome, but all those commands are not part of macOS. So. But they are very handy. So let's start with that one. No, let's not start with that one. Let's. How many PHP guys do we have in here? How many people would prefer a different language? If we can decide on a language that's consistent, I might be able to show a script
How
that.
about JavaScript?
Yeah.
Well, we can do JavaScript, but it doesn't have a sleep command. I was going to show bad programming and then show good programming. Okay, so. Oh, it's not that hard to have bad programming in C. So. The scary part is I could write bash and PHP and they'd be almost identical. Right, okay, so even if you're not familiar with either PHP or bash, which I'm not sure this is either, it's pseudocode. What do we think this is going to do?
Sleep for 2 seconds.
Okay, what's it going to do first?
Hello.
It's going to say hello and then sleep for 2 seconds and then world. What's going to happen while it's sleeping?
Block everything.
It'll block everything. So basically nothing, a whole lot of nothing. A whole 2 seconds of nothing. You're wasting time. CPU cycles are cheap, but not that cheap. Okay, so let's go into JavaScript land. And anyone not familiar with set timeout? Okay, so set timeout basically says I'm going to define something to execute and say execute it sometime in the future, right? So in this case, we're going to do something called console.log, and we're not writing Ruby. Yes, I know semicolons are optional, but I'm a C programmer, so semicolons are not optional. All right, so what do we have here? Let me save this real quick. What do we have here? It's essentially the same thing as the last bit of pseudocode that I wrote, right? With one major, subtle, but very important distinction. What's that distinction?
It's not going to block while it waits 2 seconds.
It's not going to block while it waits 2 seconds. We're still sending hello to the screen and then world. But while we're waiting, we can potentially do other stuff. We have no other event handlers defined here, but we could potentially be doing other stuff. And let's go ahead and run that. Right? Nothing too spectacular. Okay. Our next example is actually netdemo.js, and this is one that I think I pulled from Node.js.org. So since I have internet for the time being, that's Node.js.org. I don't know why they've replaced Ryan Dahl's video with something from Walmart, but apparently Walmart is using Node.js for something. Okay, so ignore that top part for a bit. This example is right there. Here is an example of a simple TCP server which listens on port leet and echoes whatever you send it. So here's the code. Listen on port 1337 on localhost. And let's go ahead and run that. Node net demo. Doing a whole bunch of nothing, right? So in theory, I should be able to see not a whole lot going on my CPUs. Of course, that's not the only thing this machine's doing, so I see some activity, but not a whole lot. I certainly don't see any busy waiting. So let's go ahead and telnet to localhost, what was it, 1337? And, ooh, we got some IPv6 in there. So it says echo server, and I can say hi, and I get hi back. Hello, hello world, hello JavaScript meetup. You get the idea, right? And then let's see if I remember how to exit telnet. Okay. Cool. So how many of us actually write TCP servers and write things directly to the TCP protocol? One person. So I actually have. I still think I'm crazy for having done it. I'm a mail nerd, which I'm also crazy for being a mail nerd. Email. You don't. No, different spelling. It's actually spelled differently. It's one of those homonyms or something like that. Homophones? Homophones. Right, so I have this little, well, I already have a text editor up. Why not pull it up there? So I wrote a lot of Node code, and it's basically the same thing. Require net, so pull in net, create a server talking TCP, and do a whole bunch of stuff which I won't go through because it's complicated and it's text processing, and you really don't want to look at it. I guarantee it. So yes, some people do use Node for raw TCP communications, but most of us are probably not going to do that. And most of the examples in Node that I've seen don't do raw TCP communication. Usually they, if I can find Chrome again, they do something like, this simple web server written in Node responds with hello world for every request. Let's do that. And thankfully,
I think the big takeaway is that you're writing a web server in like 8 months.
oh yeah, small game. You don't have to write what 400 lines of C for a simple web server that doesn't follow the protocol, and
There's a lot of responsibility that comes with that,
400,000.
too, because you've got to start handling all kinds of different stuff that you kind of took for granted on Apache or whatever.
Yeah. I taught a C++ class once, and as the final project had the students write a simple HTTP server. I don't think they liked me for it. So, yes, 8 lines of code, simple HTTP server. All it's doing is returning hello world for every web request, and similar sort of pattern. So even though we're doing HTTP instead of TCP, we still create a server and we still listen. So same patterns. Let's go ahead and pull that up in a browser. Hello world. And like the documentations. I'm sorry? Oh, is it off the screen? There we go. And like it said, it's for every web request, so we can type something that's definitely not there and we still get hello world back. Very quickly, we can get information from this REQ object and get like the path that was actually typed in the address bar and that sort of thing. And we can write our own routing engine, because that's what everybody wants to do when they write a web app. They want to write their own routing engine, right? That's what Rails gives us. Okay. One important takeaway is, I'm going to refresh that page, and this is Chrome's web inspector, WebKit's web inspector actually, which if you haven't used it, it's awesome. It's by far the best JavaScript debugger, at least on the client side, and network debugger and that sort of thing. So let's look at this particular request. Look at the response headers. Take a look at that. Anybody know offhand what that HTTP header helps us do? And if you've watched Ryan Dahl's talk, you know the answer to this question.
It sends it in parts, right? As it's available?
Yeah, as it's available. That's the key part. So it does send it in parts. And this allows us to send a piece, wait, send another piece, wait, send another piece, and that sort of thing. What sort of applications do you think this might be useful in? Okay, that's one application. But before we have real-time collaboration, what's streaming? And that's exactly where it came from, according to Ryan Dahl. I assume he's accurate. But yeah, this enables us to send a bunch of video, send a bunch more video, send a bunch more video, and on the client side, we don't have to wait for the entire video to get downloaded before we can start watching it. Otherwise, YouTube would be painful to watch, right? Unfortunately, this is not designed to be directly consumed by a web browser, so we can't actually see this in action using Chrome. So we're going to have to go back to Telnet. And real quick, we'll expand our code to do kind of a combination of the first Node app that we wrote and the most recent one that we wrote. It's basically the same thing, except we're splitting hello and world into different pieces, and we have a set timeout in there. So as you can imagine, it waits 2 seconds, and then, or it sets a timer for 2 seconds in the future, and when that timer fires, it sends world. Who knows what a closure is, besides that? Who wants to volunteer and answer for what a closure is? Sure.
It's an anonymous function found in line or something like that. We call it later.
It's not necessarily anonymous. It's
There's-
a function with internal data implied.
There we go. That's the key part. So yes, most of the time it's implemented as an anonymous function. But the important part is that it's something to be executed and some data that comes along with it. So in this case, we're storing the response. Res.end is used inside the anonymous function, and the response object is kind of kept around. And thankfully, JavaScript is nice enough that that just happens. We don't have to think about it. We don't have to deal with like in C, freeing and allocating our own memory and making sure that it stays around as long as it needs to stay around. It's just there, thanks to closures. The Wikipedia article on closure is awesome, and it mentions some of the subtle distinctions between anonymous function and closure, and what a closure is and isn't, and how you can get yourself into trouble if you use too many of them. And you certainly can get yourself into trouble. Your brain starts to explode. Right, so let's go ahead and take a look at chunked. And of course, we're speaking HTTP, so we do need to actually send an HTTP request. Pretty awesome, right? Very low level, but still pretty awesome. All right, where do I want to go from here? In the real world. Let's check out. I'm not sure if this is like a clone of HackPad or a fork of HackPad or something like that. Okay. I always forget how to start it. Run.sh, that looks good. And run.sh. It spits out a lot of debug stuff. If you're on the Wi-Fi, this will come in handy in a minute. use that IP address. And the port is whatever it said, 9001, I think. 9001. So on my machine, I'll go to localhost
What was that one again?
9001. Yeah, let's go with that.
What was your IP address?
It is.
Do you need a Wi-Fi password?
So it looks like I'm the only one in here. So we'll and I think if you actually go to the root, if you type Colorado Springs.js, you'll end up there. Ah, someone else has joined. My Spanish is rusty, so O or A? O/A.
A lot of different, similar
Hmm? Different but similar one.
Yeah.
Huh. I can't promise it doesn't have bugs. So here, this is a Node app that I'm running on my machine. I'm a user to it, and thankfully, this is kind of cool. I actually have unintentionally have the network traffic still up, and you can see a whole lot of stuff is happening. I think this actually uses WebSockets, socket.io, that library, which is a whole nother topic. But kind of taking that chunked transfer encoding to a whole new level. And that basically allows you to, rather than just having a web request coming from your machine going to a server and then you get a response back and that's it, the server can basically open a socket to your computer and send you data, which is great for things that you want that sort of thing to happen with. Yeah. No one's going to correct my butchering of Spanish. that would prevent that from happening. All right, so I'll leave that up so you guys who are still using it. I see 3 people. One of them is me. Go ahead, keep hacking at it. I'm going to show you the app that I'm supporting in production. Shield your eyes now because it is awful code. So this is it's a collaborative editing sort of thing, but it's really more of a collaborative graffiti app for the web. Thankfully, it's not as obnoxious as some of the graffiti you see around because you have to be using the app in order to see the graffiti. I also can't promise that there will be anything nice that is posted here because for the most part, it's completely anonymous. Let me pull that up. Actually, looks like there's nothing there. Let's go somewhere else where some people might have a different opinion. There we go. So people have drawn these pictures or words on Google. And basically the way it works is you take your mouse and draw on the screen. It sends that back to a server that I have the unfortunate pleasure of hosting, and anyone else who's looking at this sees that appear in real time on their screen. And if you go to a site later on, you see what's been posted there in eternity. You can erase things, but I try to respect other people's graffiti. So you can draw and it stays there. Turn it off, turn it back on again, it's still there.
How is it stored on the server?
Flat files.
Really?
Yeah. Like I said before, like this. Think the Stone Age of Node. So we've talked in the past about, do we want to start storing things in like a database? Like now that we have these things called NoSQL databases, which are very JavaScripty, do we want to start using one of them? And we just haven't had the time to do anything like that. Yeah. Right. So.
Got real.
Using quite a few modules, using quite a few other pieces of JavaScript code. Yeah, this is what actually stores all the stuff. Page store class, and at some point in time, oh geez. Okay, at some point in time, we built this switchboard sort of thing. This is we built our own routing engine because one didn't exist for Node at the time. Again, I'm using that defense. It didn't exist for Node. We had to build it all from scratch. So everything you see here is pretty much part of Node from the beginning, except for some of the things that we required, which had been built at the beginning. Pretty much every one of these items refers to a path. The first piece of a path that you could type in goggles.sneakygcr.net/leaderboard/register, that sort of thing. And within each, there's another nesting of routing engine. Talk about closures till your head hurts. Closures till your head hurts. There's actually we use Trello for project management for this particular app. There's a card in there that's make the routing engine not have so many closures, so it doesn't have to evaluate all of them before it figures out where to send you. This is one of those cases where the app rapidly outgrew what it was originally designed to do, and bad design decisions made at the beginning kind of propagated throughout the rest.
Just waiting for someone to buy it.
Yeah. Let's see. Other interesting things. Oh, yeah. There's a tool called Phantom.js, which is awesome, but outside of the scope of this, which kind of builds its own Node-like infrastructure that does like screen capture sort of things that we're using. And that's actually pretty cool. So I can share this. And I can log in, which...
We don't have your password.
Yeah, I have no idea what my password is. Neither of those. But then you can go... over here and see various things that people have shared. And apparently it's having some issues. So this particular app has, let's see, I'm going to say an average of 400,000 requests a day. Corresponding to... Oh, it looks like we're actually up to 800 unique users in today or yesterday. I don't remember when these images get generated, which is actually pretty cool. And what was amazing is that when I started recording these numbers, I was absolutely blown away because the load on the server
What counts as a request?
An actual HTTP request.
So when you draw a little picture, is that one request or is that like 200 requests?
It's one request. Yeah. It waits until you finish drawing. It basically mouse up, sends the request. So virtually imperceptible. This sold me on Node. One of the things that's very popular with Node at this point is something called Express. Someone mentioned it during the intros. It didn't exist when we wrote Goggles, but now it builds that routing engine for you, and it makes it very easy to write like web apps and that sort of thing. It's very nice. Don't get me wrong. But I kind of feel like, and this is popular among the it's not Rails, but we're going to make it look like Rails community. This happens with PHP. This happens with .NET. Everybody says, if you want something that's like Rails in another language, why don't you just use Rails? Which to a certain extent I agree. And sometimes I feel like Express kind of does that. Express makes it very easy to write a web app in Node.js. But if that's the only reason you're using Node.js is so you can write a cool MVC-style web app in JavaScript, forgive me, but I think you're missing the point of Node.js. The point of Node.js really is this non-blocking paradigm that doesn't exist in any other platform. And that was one of the reasons that Ryan Dahl chose to use JavaScript as his implementation language for what became Node. He wasn't looking to make JavaScript run a whole bunch of places or make JavaScript do anything special. He was looking to
Make an upload progress indicator, I think.
Really?
Yeah.
yeah, something like that. He wanted. I'm looking for Keynote and not finding it. Yeah, this evented non-blocking I/O. That was his primary concern. He liked Gmail and wanted to see it more places. So Gmail, you get an email message. From what I hear, I don't actually use the Gmail interface, but you receive an email and it shows up in the web interface magically. And he wanted to do that in more places. And JavaScript just happened to fit the bill because nothing like it existed for JavaScript. JavaScript wasn't already burdened by some sort of paradigm that existed for writing JavaScript on the server, so he could do whatever he wanted. JavaScript as a language is very flexible, so you can, it's almost like Ruby in that you can write just about anything, like just type gibberish at the command line and it'll actually do something, or fail gracefully. And there was a thriving community behind JavaScript because it's already in the browser, so anybody who's doing anything with web already knows JavaScript. I feel like there's a faster way to do this, but I'm not going to. Other Node.js stuff. I will upload the code that was in this demo with a lot of the code that I referenced is already in Git repositories already. So I'm not going to copy the code into another Git repository. It'll be submodules. But not right now. This doesn't exist right now. But sometime shortly after tonight, you can run these commands in a command line and get all the code that was mentioned tonight. And with that, I think, oh, awesome. I met my goal of talking for less than an hour. Well, you can't see, but talking for less than an hour. And now I want to open it up to discussion. I know there are a couple of people who are using Node already, so I'm definitely interested in hearing your thoughts on basically what I left out. because in order to get it to 50 minutes, or actually 45, I had to leave a whole bunch out. So I'm interested in hearing things you're using Node for currently, things you really like about it, things you don't like about it, if there are any. I think Node is awesome, but there have to be shortcomings somewhere. And other questions and that sort of thing.
I would throw out another big thing about Node that it does really well is the string aspect. It's kind of string oriented. So you can take, imagine, like your streaming examples, you've got, say, gigabytes of data coming through the system. Take this much memory to handle it because it's oriented towards streams. So a lot of web frameworks, you got to load a whole bunch of stuff into memory, do something with it, and then do something else with that chunk of memory. The Node's oriented in such a way that you can actually stream and plug streams together, kind of like the Unix style. So that's another big strength of Node 2.
I'm not using it. I'm just curious. Patrick made the comment earlier that if you have your own Node.js server, there's a lot of other things you need to keep track of. I'm kind of curious what those things are. I guess the comment I think you're talking about was when I was saying you get the web server, cheap, but then you have to do a bunch of other stuff, right? And I mean, the simple example is those things we saw where it was answering one request and the other request. Like, if you want to host files off your server at the same time, you've got to plug in some other thing that's going to be able to access the file system to be able to just deliver, JPEG or something. And maybe you should be offloading that, but a lot of people have one server and that's what it does for them. And so you have to start messing around with a lot of things that you get cheaply from other kinds of systems. So like by default, they won't just go access your file system, and then it doesn't have like controls to not serve kinds of files that Apache or IIS is kind of doing for you. And so you get all that power, and you get a lot of, it's really a clean slate, but then you sort of have to implement or include all this other stuff.
What about you create your little server? What happens if it, for whatever reason, blows up? Is there any sort of automatic restart or failover?
I don't know if I want to show you what I'm doing.
I think there's some people have made solutions to that.
And actually, I saw
But they're new.
there's something called Forever. It's a
Yeah,
Node
totally.
module, and I didn't know it existed, but I'll have to look into it now, because what we're doing is ask questions while I find the file I'm looking for.
So you have to kind of solve some problems like that. Like he's going to run Node instead of this thing called Forever. And so Forever is like a wrapper around your Node that watches for Node to crash. If it does, reboots it.
Nothing's perfect.
Yeah, totally. But I mean, this is young tech, right? I mean, it's a couple of years old now or something like that. So you get your hands dirty.
I think that's one of the things that's really amazing about it is it's so young and there's so much out there for it now. Like it just exploded overnight and there's people just write anything for it now. It's crazy.
So that's what I'm doing. While true. So every time it crashes, it just restarts it.
Yeah.
No,
The other thing I was going to add to what Patrick was saying is that we're, with IIS and Apache and even Nginx and some of the new web servers that are coming around, we're kind of used to the paradigm that we run a web server and it looks at a document root. There's this directory and all the files in it are somehow meaningful to us as web users. And I think Node, and to a certain extent some like MVC frameworks like Rails and Cake PHP and Drupal is even this way. Whatever you type in the address bar has absolutely nothing to do with what's actually in the file system. And I think Node represents kind of a paradigm shift in the web app and the web server are more closely coupled together. So the referencing a particular file on disk is the exception rather than the norm.
yeah, I've well, this appealed to me because I've been thinking around some J2EE stuff just to create a web server. You got to stand up a J2EE environment and create a Word file in the right format,
I'd be interested in hearing and seeing, so Node is focused on the server side. I'd be interested in seeing sort of what the front end of a typical Node app might look like. Well, in sort of a similar way to how Angular, you did a great Angular talk about that, is focused on the front end and that sort of doesn't give much in terms of the back end. Like where is that just a misconception or?
So I think I understand what you're asking, and there's no like Node is front end agnostic. You can write a TCP server in Node, and TCP is your front end. You can write an HTTP server in Node, and HTTP is your front end. You can write a web app in Node, and then web pages are your front end. In this case,
it ends up being service consumers, I think, right? Because you end up writing services with Node more, and so you're going to ask for particular responses to questions you might have in whatever form.
Yeah, one of the typical things to do is to just write in your node, that's accessing your database, and it's serving out with some JSON. And that's all that it does. And then you have like your own front end, which consumes that JSON until it's ready for your website. And you could use Node as well to actually serve up the Node.js files and your HTML, JavaScript, and stuff like that. So I think it's called they're calling it a lead stack now.
What's it mean?
If you look at mean, let's see, mean.io, that's good. Is that what I'm looking for? But it basically starts you out with, here's a full JavaScript stack from your server backend to your front end. And kind of look at that and see some of the stuff that it's doing. So what was that you just said? Mean, MEAN. .io. Really mean to you. Mongo Express. Mongo Express, Angular, and Node.
Is a Node server usually run on Linux?
Yes.
I think that's the typical.
I think with the word usually in there, I think that answer would be yes. There's nothing preventing you from running it on Windows. There is a Windows version of Node, but I think there's more of a correlation between people who use Node and people who use Mac OS or Linux. That it just kind of happened by accident. It's not that we hate Windows; it's just that we don't use it.
I don't like Windows either. You said, but I'm not used to using a Mac, and you said what you were using wasn't Mac OS. So what were you using? You have like Linux installed on your Mac?
So I am using Mac OS, but I make heavy use of aliases and like other command line tools and tricks.
Node works
make
great
things.
on Mac though. You don't have to edit your Mac. It works great out of the box.
Yeah.
What works for you?
Node does.
Oh,
Yeah, there's no fancy.
He was just saying he's customized his Mac. So a lot of the commands that he was doing were not typical out of the box Mac commands.
So like I typed www, that doesn't exist on a Mac. I typed edit, that doesn't exist on a Mac. Everything else I think is either came from installing Node or is out of the box on a Mac.
so if you have Mac, I mean, like, if I had with a Windows machine, I can install Linux, boot it to Linux or boot it to Windows. Would you ever want to do that with Mac? Is that similar?
I'd say no for what you're doing. Wouldn't you agree?
I have fought with that very question. So before I was a Mac user, I had a machine that I dual booted between Windows and Linux, and that was just painful. I was in college at the time. Their Wi-Fi was really stupid, and if I wanted to connect to the Wi-Fi from Linux, I had to spend half an hour connecting to the Wi-Fi, and then I'd get to whatever I was trying to get to, and then by that time class was over. Right, because when else are you trying to connect to the Wi-Fi? So I gave up and got a Mac because I wanted to be able to open the lid and just have it connected to I wanted it to just work. So there are certain things that are definitely like very Linux friendly, and I came across some totally irrelevant, but Facebook made PHP better and there's this thing called HHVM. It's like a replacement for PHP. Ignore all that. That they don't really have a Mac version yet, so I did actually install Linux on another machine that I'm using that for. But for the most part, I would say the answer is no. Everything you can do on Linux, you can do on a Mac as well.
So you mentioned that there's a different port of Node for Windows. If you're running it on a Mac, you would then have to worry about when I put this into production on a Linux server. Is there any potential for it
I
to?
think it's one version. So like Windows, you can run a certain version of Node on Windows. You can also run that on any other server. But the more recent versions of Node are better supported on ESD.
Node seems to be internally consistent. So I can say I develop goggles on this machine right here. But the server that I deploy it to is Debian, Linux, whatever the latest is, Wheezy, both running the same version of Node. Node wasn't, I think it still isn't packaged for Debian, so I did have to create a package of Node for Debian to install it on the server. So I got to pick the version of Node I was using.
So those all look like the same.
But the biggest issue that I've run into in deployment has nothing to do with Node itself. It's other dependencies that I'm using. So, for instance, for the taking a snapshot of what you've drawn, I'm using Phantom.js, which I had to go and find. It makes use of the fonts that are installed locally on the system. Basically, the way Phantom works is it kind of creates a virtual Chrome window, which means that it pulls all the fonts from the system that Phantom is running on, not your whatever system the user is viewing it with. So I ran into font issues. That was the biggest issue in any deployment that I've dealt with.
You said you have a big node stack, didn't you? I think so.
Yeah.
How's that thing going?
Well, our failover is one line more sophisticated than what he has. Because it's just Slack and certain tanks and address it. But yeah, it's just it's not actually loaded like that. Just using Ubuntu Upstart, get process dice restarted. So that's going back to it being like a full backend solution and different from Apache or Nginx or IIS. The whole server is running in that process. So if you have an unhandled exception, it's not like a CGI script or things like that. There where script execution will fail, the server will still be running. If you have an hot exception, the whole process will tank. No one will get served anymore. That's kind of a radical departure from web services that existed in the past.
Did you overcome that, or is that still popping up?
No,
It's
We're
either
not,
good or bad, depending
we don't
on
have
whether
a-
you like it or not.
we're not really publicly deployed yet, so
Okay.
the way we have learned to touch it internally, like we definitely don't run into anything unhandled. That's still a problem.
This doesn't work. Don't touch it.
Hit that button.
I guess it makes you write good code, huh?
Yeah, I mean, it goes to our corporate chat servers, and that's 3 in the morning, so addressing one of your questions too, as far as putting this stuff, it's not really the emphasis of Node, but there are several templating engines out there, custom set on that Express framework. So if you want to write HTML-like stuff, that'll give you nice looking forms and some default styling. It's definitely not the emphasis of the technology of the platform, but those things exist as well, like Java server bases or Twitter Bootstrap, maybe not so much, but there are like server-side templating, but there's definitely not the emphasis, and there's not a standard like front end like Ajax standard or anything like that. But it's really all server-side. That's one of the first what is going on here things to get about moving
It's interesting because I've used a couple of like NPM packages on the front end, though. It's all good.
Oh, yeah.
That's what was
And-
kind of confusing me. Is I was reading up on something called like Browserify, where apparently you can use node modules that you make on the front end. So now it's kind of like bridging the gap.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to do. But it seems like you can still use it. It still seems very useful, just as the package manager in general, as like setting up a dev environment. Like, it seems like everything's kind of there. You can use that to definitely enhance your front end.
Node's actually become my favorite replacement for Bash, too. Seriously, like command line utilities, so much easier to write in Node. there's some nice libraries for the back end that just like.
I'm gonna kill Etherpad if anyone's still using it.
Can you give an example of one of the ones command line thing you're building?
Let's see, well, the first one I did is actually there's an npm package. If you go to npm, it's npm.org, I think, in search.
I'm gonna guess not.
But I need
npmjs.org.
Search for Pippi, P-I-P-P-I. So we use I don't know why there's two. Oh, I did pip originally, and then somebody was like, "There's a Python tool, you can't." I'm like, all right. So I changed it to Pippi. So we use a Freckle, Freckle.com for time tracking, and they had an API, so I just wrote a little command line utility so I could track my time in the command line. Just didn't have to leave my command line. So that's all this is, and this is. I mean, it's interesting. You get down to the usage. I mean, it's just a command line utility. You've got a couple commands. You've got various options you can throw in there, and I know it was just really easy to create it and then just connect up to a REST API. So, yeah, I tend to, if I just have to do a couple lines of something on my computer, I just write a JavaScript and run through Node. It's kind of nice.
Because like Node comes out of the box with a bunch of file system utilities, networking utilities, what else? It's like a bunch of kind of.
There's a lot of stuff, and it seems to change every version, what they've actually included or excluded. But yeah, Node.js.org, the documentation is really, really good.
Crypto.
You can tell what I've looked at: file system, HTTP, net.
Yeah.
I know I've looked at more than that, but
So, I mean, there's a ton you can do out of the box just with Node. With the packages, make it really nice to just find something that's pretty much there and then use it to write your own stuff.
I'd be curious about that data moving thing we're talking about. Is there any more detail you can give us about like what we're solving with that, or?
Proxies is where you see that a lot. So Node is really great at any kind of proxying that you want to do, whether that's path-based or port-based or protocol-based. You know, this much code, you can proxy gigabytes of data without seeing any flinch on the system at all. And so you're just using the stream API. And you know, remember when you had the pipe call there, that first example? The user connected and we have the incoming stream. You take that incoming stream, pipe that somewhere else, and that thing might be piped somewhere else, and that, depending on how you configure this thing, the sky's the limit. So that's another, it's just a cool building blocks with tons and tons of data. So proxying is where I've seen it the most.
Do we have any Node projects they'd like to show or talk about?
I did have a question though. Something that I'm still a little fuzzy on is how to know what node or what problems Node is good at solving. Like, how, you know, if I'm thinking of, is it just? It seems from what I saw, is like its main strength is the non-blocking sort of thing. So is it really just if you need something blazing fast that can handle a ton of connections, like Node would be good for that? And also, you had made some comment on on Express, maybe that losing something in translation if you were to use that? I guess we'll just kind of clarify that.
Yeah. So I'd say if you're building a website, if you're just building a website, don't use Node. Node is overkill. If you're building a kind of your general class of web apps, like of course every one that just came to mind is something that uses Node or has a real-time component. Your general web application, stuff that PHP is great at, Node is overkill for. And that's, you hit on blazing fast. I thought about putting something to that effect on this slide, but that's really, like, Node isn't, it's not, the JavaScript doesn't execute any faster than JavaScript executes. Like, it's not, you're not getting performance gains just because the code compiles down to some awesome bytecode that's highly optimized, and you'll spend fewer CPU cycles doing the same thing. No, that's not where the performance increases come from. It really is this throughput. So if you're doing a lot of, are you familiar with the terms CPU bound and IO bound? It's basically, are you spending a lot of time reading from disk, so your slow point is the disk reads, versus are you doing a lot of processing, so your bottleneck is the processing time? A lot of what we do, I would venture that statistically or probabilistically, 100% of anything we do is data driven, right? We're dealing with a lot of data, which the more data we're dealing with, the more rapidly we get to everything is disk bound, because everything, unless you're using Node, you ask for a file and you're blocking while you're asking for that file. The disk has to spin up if you're using those irritating green disks, and then you have to seek to the file, you have to get the file, you have to read the file into memory, and this operating system has to give you the contents of the file, and you're blocking the whole time. Node takes that out of the equation. So now your bottleneck is the CPU, and since most of these applications that we're talking about are otherwise disk bound, the amount of requests, I'm going to use the web situation, the number of requests that you can serve concurrently, because we all know computers don't really do concurrent things, but concurrently goes up dramatically, because you don't, while the operating system is going and fetching something from the disk, your app is asking for the URL that someone else requested and doing other things. Other events are happening. So it's spending less time executing. It's spending less time not executing code is probably the best way to describe it. So rather than sleeping is bad. Don't use that as an excuse to stay up all night tonight. But sleeping is bad. And with Node, there is no sleep command. You can't find it anywhere. It doesn't exist. So because everything is event-driven, you spend a lot more time. You can spend a lot more time responding to events. And the likelihood that if you're idle, the likelihood that you can respond to a new request is much higher because you're idle a whole lot more of the time.
For more complicated requests as well, if it has to make back-end API calls or multiple database calls or something that theoretically could be done in parallel, which in a more traditional paradigm would take explicit thread management. It'll auto-parallelize and then return all that's done. So it saves on hard to read code. It's explicit thread management, explicit parallelism. So it makes the code difficult to write in a different way, but tasks that theoretically can be done in parallel don't block. And something that serves a single user request that requires 5 or 6 background operations, there's no explicit management to order the parallelism.
It sounds like you kind of have to know what you're doing to take advantage of that in a certain way. I mean, you had mentioned makes code writing difficult.
It's event-driven, so you need a callback mechanism. Like in a block function scope, everything will execute in parallel, so you can say So that takes some getting used to. But then, again, if you're doing 5 background operations, they'll all execute in parallel. Just merge it back together. Way simpler, like less lines of code patching than doing something in Java or something.
There is a, just to be silly here, is a sleep. It only has one option, it sleeps forever. And it's file read sync / dev none, or dev random.
He brings up a good point. There are so the whole idea behind this is that everything should be non-blocking, which a corollary to that is everything should be asynchronous. There are some things in Node that you can specify do this synchronously, like read from files. And actually, in Goggles, there are a lot of the file reads are synchronous. Just because if I were reading from a file and then had a callback, and then had to do a database call and have a callback from that, then you'd get closures, just mind-bogglingly complex closures, and then I didn't feel like fighting with that. I got lazy programming. So you can do some things synchronously, but in general, the idea is that you try to avoid that. And also, if you're writing, let's say, Node modules, especially for things like MySQL, like databases are a database connection over a TCP socket. You send a request and you wait for something to come back. It's obvious to make that blocking. If you're writing a Node module to do that, you have to take extra care to make sure that you don't write that in a way that such that it'll be blocking, so that you can take a callback and that sort of thing. But I think most of us, at least to start with, will be on the side of using Node modules and not writing Node modules. So hopefully you don't have to worry about that.
Is it used mostly to read from databases, or can you do LDAP queries, like LDAP search?
Yeah, there's an LDAP library connected to LDAP servers.
One could argue that LDAP is itself a database, but I won't go there.
And you're right, one could argue that, I mean, way down deep, it is a database, but, I mean, like an e-directory or a subdirectory, or that thing. I'm not talking about Active Directory, that's usually what's considered. A lot of people call that.
It's LDAP with lots of backwards things. Hopefully lots of Microsoft people are listening. It's LDAP with lots of backwards things hacked on top of it. It's okay, Open Directory is the same way. Apple, are you listening? Yeah.
So one referral to Mongo and their database is obviously a big deal. How difficult is it for custom houses building databases to get an interface with Node.js? So they get that set up.
Are you talking people who architect databases and are using like MySQL or Mongo or something like that to connect a Node.js app with an existing database? Anything you can do in JavaScript, you can do in Node. And I'd say anything you can do in any other language, you could probably do in JavaScript as well. You'd have to do it differently, but so I don't think there's anything preventing. Money is the only thing preventing those people from building something that works with Node.
Do you have C drivers for that database? And that's Node. That's one other thing is they have these. Node has these things called add-ons. Basically allows you to write C code, and then there's a very used to be well-defined interface that you can actually go between JavaScript and C world or native land. So a lot of these database bindings are actually C code drivers, and then they'll go through these Node add-ons, and then you can import those as a module, and that is your JavaScript drivers in the database. So that's another approach too, if you already have like C code drivers.
So that reminded me, totally unrelated, but something that I think is awesome about JavaScript. So JavaScript, everything is, let's see, make sure I get this right. Nothing is private, and everything is static. So, who here uses Java? Who here uses C++? Who here uses one of the .NET languages? Objective-C. Any language that's object-oriented, that has a concept of static and private, it's all a figment of your imagination. Everything in a computer at some level is public and static. JavaScript doesn't delude you with that. Everything in JavaScript is public and static. So you can get to everything whenever you want. No, because it doesn't matter anyway.
I'm assuming the memory footprint on this is pretty small.
Yeah.
All you're doing is you've got a bunch of
And that's where you have to worry about. One of the reasons that I made the distinction about what a closure is and isn't earlier, because if you have a whole bunch of closures that are, we'll call them unresolved, they haven't been executed yet, all that memory is still being held onto, and who knows when the closure is actually going to execute. If you have a lot of those hanging around, then your memory footprint might be massive compared to the amount of code that you're actually executing. In my app, a lot of the memory footprint that you saw is disk cache. Yeah. So the memory footprint of the app is not real big. It could be smaller because there are a lot of closures that are poorly implemented, but a lot of it is because we're using flat files instead of a database.
How hard is it to bring down?
Goggles?
No, no.
By bring down, you mean crash. Okay. I think it depends a whole lot, and you might have more experience with this. No. Sorry, I don't know your name. But
Drew.
Drew, with the larger node instance than I have, I think it probably depends a lot on the application and what it's doing. Node itself, by comparison, is probably more stable. But I would say it's probably fairly easy to write code that might crash. Especially, so things that people often complain about JavaScript. No real type checking, no real, like you can create variables on the fly and they just have a value of undefined, or they have a type of undefined and a value of undefined. Oh, that's one of the awesome things about Java, JavaScript. If you've never seen this video, go search WAT. I'll show you the link. I'm not going to, well, I don't know. We'll see if we have interest in time. But go search WAT. And this result, it's like a 5-minute video. It's absolutely hilarious. There's some Ruby in there. There's plenty of JavaScript in there. It talks about how things in JavaScript can have multiple types depending on how you look at them. People think that Perl is going away. No, it's just called JavaScript.
I've heard people claim it's easy to bring down, but I've never experienced that. So,
I think one of the big things is it's easy to have memory leaks, which you can crash.
Isn't that like the exiting problem?
kind of a little bit exhausted at this point. Thanks, Brian. That was a really great presentation and discussion starter.